How prophecy and conspiracy are linked. Jesus said in Matthew 24 concerning the end times, "Watch out that no one deceive you." And the Apostle Paul said in 2 Thessalonians, "Let no one deceive you by any means." And Revelation 13 says of the two-horned beast, "By the signs it performs, it will deceive those who dwell on the earth." So the main feature of the end times are of a massive deception all over the world. Today, with the advancement of technology, the means of spreading messages and information to all parts of the earth has allowed for truth and deception to spread far and wide. But oftentimes truth is called conspiracy theory, and deception is portrayed as trusted sources of information. This video will look at the prophecies from the viewpoint of the conspiracy theories from the 20th century up to our modern times of today in a post-COVID world. The beast of Revelation 13, with 7 heads and 10 horns, symbolically representing all governments, confirmed by the symbolic numbers of 7 and 10. Each represents completeness or fullness of man's governmental authority under the influence of the dragon, the one called devil and Satan. This is how the ruling governmental authority operates, from the most powerful governments to the least powerful governments, falling in line behind the dominant powers or face destruction. So it doesn't matter where you live on this earth, you are under a beast government, be it a democracy, a dictatorship, a republic, or a monarchy. They are just different forms of the same beast. Babylon the Great Harlot, the central bank cabal, also called Mystery Babylon. A mystery because it is a symbol that means different things and represents more than just one thing. It seems to be made up of multiple parts, but each part attempting to ride and control the beast governments. And that is the main clue to the first part of its identity. When governments are set up, one of the first influences on the government is the influence of the banks and control of the money supply, and the central bank system has targeted all nations to control the power of a nation's money and resources. The two-horned wild beast of Revelation 13. It is said of this beast that it has 2 horns like a lamb, but speaks like the dragon. The dragon's speech is lies, and he is called the father of the lie. Also, this beast has 2 horns, with the number 2 symbolizing a union of 2 governments. As the 20th century began, the British Empire was an established world power, and the United States of America, one of Britain's former colonies, was a rising power. In the 20th century, these 2 governments would forge an alliance that would go on to shape and lead the world into a new world order, with America becoming the most powerful government in the history of the world, with the US dollar becoming the world's reserve currency, a role that it would take over from Great Britain after World War II. But this Anglo-American power would speak like the dragon, with lies and deception that will eventually threaten all life on earth. The White Horse, deception through money. This symbol of a white horse and rider conquering and bent on conquest is a representation of the deception. Before any physical war begins, the money moves first, by means of the central bank system, to make agreements for the transfer of money and assets to the central bank before their country is destroyed by physical war. By creating safe havens controlled by the central bank, the United States would be conquered by the central bank system with the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, the so-called creature from Jekyll Island. This central bank would go on to be the most powerful central bank on earth. The events of the next horse would make sure America would begin to take its dominant and destructive role on this earth. The Red Warhorse rides into World War I, 1914. In December 1913, the Federal Reserve Act would be signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson, and by some coincidence, the Great War, World War I, would erupt in Europe in August 1914. This bloody war among the old empires of Britain, France, Austria, Russia, and Germany would lead to the United States and its Federal Reserve System becoming a major player on the world stage. The war resulted in larger Federal Reserve holdings of gold, as gold flowed from Europe into the U.S., increasing the U.S. dollar and America's status as a creditor nation. With Europe in ruins and 40 million people dead from the war, we must ask the question, why? For what reason was there so much bloodshed? The first image of the beast, the League of Nations, 1920. Planned and proposed by the United States and Britain after World War I to be a scheme to maintain world peace by preventing wars through collective security and disarmament, and settling disputes through negotiation and arbitration. This worldwide organization would be an attempt by the two-horned beast power to begin to set up the framework for world government, to rule over all nations on earth. But it would fail and become inactive, and so the red horse would ride again, as mankind would once again witness the beast governments begin to tear themselves to pieces like animals. A financial earthquake and economic darkness, the Great Depression, 1929 to 1939. Beginning in 1929 with an economic shockwave that would shake almost all countries across the world. The Great Depression was a period of economic depression that became evident after a major fall in stock prices in the United States, starting in September 1929, and led to the epic Wall Street crash of October 1929, called Black Thursday. It was the largest, deepest, and most widespread depression of the 20th century. The U.S. Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, at the critical moment of the crisis, would contract and shrink the money supply, triggering the collapse of 608 banks around the country, and send the United States and the world into a deep, dark 10-year depression that the world would finally come out of and be led into the most destructive war of all time. The Red Warhorse rides into World War II, a global conflict lasting from 1939 to 1945, fought as a total war, blurring the distinction between civilians and military. All would become a target of the bloodshed. Aircraft would play a major role in the conflict for the killing of civilians, and 2 nuclear weapons would be used in war for the first time ever. It would be the deadliest war in history, killing an estimated 70 to 85 million people, mainly civilians, with tens of millions dying from genocides, starvation, massacres, and disease. Jesus said in Matthew 24, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of sorrows." Two Witnesses to the World, 1945. Toward the end of World War II, the United States of America would unleash the most powerful weapons ever used in war. 2 nuclear weapons against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. They would call down fiery destruction on their enemies to send a message to the world for a witness of the great nuclear sword they now wield, and of their position as the dominant power on earth, many would begin to ask, who is like this beast, and who can do battle with it? The image of the beast returns. The United Nations, 1945. Once again, the United States and Britain would take the lead in forming the United Nations, this time with its headquarters in New York, and founded in October 1945 in San Francisco, California. This organization would seek to maintain international peace and security, develop friendly relations among nations, achieve international cooperation, and serve as a forum for nations to speak concerning issues and disputes among members. America's military, economic, and political power would move all nations to join the United Nations or face sanction and isolation from the dominant power on earth. The UFO Phenomenon, Lies and Deceptions of the Beast, 1947. Roswell, New Mexico, July 1947. Was it the crash of an extraterrestrial aircraft, a weather balloon, a top-secret military aircraft, or the beginning of a massive psychological operation by the government against the American people in the interest of preparing the public for a future deception that will lead to a massive increase in military spending and the pretext of a coming martial law at the end of the current order? Only time will tell. The Red Warhorse rides into the Cold War, 1947 to 1991. Almost immediately after World War II, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union would send the world into the Cold War. Cold because it would allow the two great powers to war against each other through regional conflicts, and not use their nuclear arsenals against each other. And this is the insanity of all beast governments, past and present. In their thirst for war and bloodshed, even against the will of its own peoples, they would have a nuclear destruction hanging over the head of everyone on earth. Israel reborn as a nation, 1948. Britain and the United States would use the United Nations to officially set up the State of Israel in Palestine, giving a home to the Jewish people who suffered a Holocaust at the hands of the Nazi regime during World War II. And many believe this to be part of the fulfillment of the prophecy that the Jews would be regathered in their land from all nations. But there is another prophecy in Revelation spoken by Jesus himself, warning of a deception by those who say they are Jews but are not, but they are a synagogue of Satan. Twice Jesus uses this warning in Revelation. So is this fulfillment of the prophecy or deception by the two-horned beast and the image of the beast? Only time will tell. The Red Warhorse rides into the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. With the smoke from World War II finally put out, another major war would begin, this time in Korea, between the North and the South, with the Communist Soviet Union and China supporting the North, and the United States and its allies supporting the South. This would be fought as a proxy war, indirect conflict between the major beast governments through the lesser governments and their people's bloodshed. But this war would also showcase the American power's new international organization, the United Nations, to attempt to de-escalate the conflict. But the opposite would happen. It would become one of the most destructive conflicts of the modern era, with 3 million people killed, mostly civilians, thousands of massacres by both sides, and the destruction of every major city in the whole country. A messenger of warning about the beast, 1961. former President Dwight D. Eisenhower would give a strong message of warning to the citizens of the United States in his farewell address in 1961, warning of the accumulating influence of the military-industrial complex, subverting the direction and destiny of the country through its grip on the massive machine of war and intelligence the U.S. had built for the various wars of its recent history. This threat that he outlined would begin to take over the country with a death blow to the head of the government just 2 short years later, putting the country on a path of war and destruction for the sake of profits and greed of massive corporations. The Last Ride of the Red Horse? The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. In 1962, the whole world would be threatened with extinction by the possibility of a global thermonuclear war between the beast government of the United States against the beast government of the Soviet Union. These two countries would take the world to the brink of disaster, and for what? For no real reason at all. Life on this earth would be brought to ruin, to its end, by a war over nothing. But it is believed that this crisis would have a profound effect on the heart of one of the leaders in this crisis, President John F. Kennedy, who would want to begin to steer his country to cooperation instead of conflict, peace instead of war, life instead of death. But the beast government would have none of it. The brutality of the beast. In November 1963, the beast government would send a powerful message to anyone who dares to threaten its thirst and hunger for war and bloodshed, with the talk of peace or cooperation. The head of the government would be cut off in broad daylight for all to see. It is not a coincidence that the decade of the 60s is called the decade of peace and love. But the beast government would rage against peace and love, and anything or anyone who could potentially threaten its ability to make war and profits. The Rampage of the Beast, 1965 to 1969. After the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, the beast government would begin a bloody rampage against every movement that could possibly disrupt the American war machine. It didn't matter if it was a peace movement, a political movement, a religious movement, or a revolutionary movement. The beast government would decapitate all of their leaders, as can be seen by the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, and Robert F. Kennedy, as well as many more. The Red Warhorse rides into the Vietnam War, 1955 to 1975. With President John F. Kennedy assassinated by the Beast, the takeover of the government by the military-industrial complex could continue, beginning with a false flag attack by the Beast government called the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, which would lead to the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution being passed by Congress, which would give the new president, Lyndon Johnson, legal justification for deploying U.S. conventional forces against North Vietnam. The bloodshed in this war that lasted for 20 years and killed over 1.6 million people. The false flag lies by this beast government shows that it speaks like the dragon, and that it is the lying, deceptive, dominant beast power of Revelation 13, with more bloodshed to come. Babylon the Great Harlot, the Big Business Cabal. The second part of the identity of Babylon the Great, big business, and there is no bigger business in the world than the business of war. With the Vietnam War running for 20 years, the selling and developing of weapons would go to an even higher level, and the war industry would grow even more influential and powerful. President Eisenhower's warning of the military-industrial complex was now too late. The dark influence of massive corporations of war on the government was now too powerful to stop, and will only get worse, and would breed other industries' push for control over the governmental beast. The Red Warhorse rides into the invasions of the beast, 1983 and 1989. With the conclusion of the Vietnam War in 1975, and the disapproval and protest of the war by a great majority of Americans against their government's warmongering, there would be a pause of military conflicts for about 8 years before the beast would start again, this time starting small with the invasions of Grenada in 1983 and the invasion of Panama in 1989, with both invasions condemned by the United Nations as a flagrant violation of international law. But the American beast would not respect any condemnation coming from the international organization that they set up for their purpose as a weapon against anyone who does not submit to their world order. The Red Warhorse rides into the Persian Gulf War, 1990 to 1991. So the American beast government, fresh off its illegal military aggression and invasions of Grenada and Panama, now turns its claws toward the Middle East with its rich oil fields, and again with lies and deception about many aspects of the conflict, like how the U.S. was inducing the Iraqi government to invade Kuwait, so it could gain another foothold in the Middle East besides its ally Israel. This conflict would kill between 100,000 and 200,000 people, almost all civilians. A great earthquake. The Soviet government collapses, 1991. A great symbolic earthquake would surprise and shake the whole world. The longtime rival of the American power would collapse off the world stage. The collapse of the Soviet Union would now mean that the Cold War was over and that the American beast government was now the dominant power on Earth with no one even close to rivaling it, and now standing as the lone superpower on Earth. In the seat of power, like past empires of Rome, Greece, Persia, Babylon, Assyria, and ancient Egypt. But what would this mean for the world? War, war, and more war. The Red Warhorse rides into the Bosnia War, 1995. This war, like the Persian Gulf War, would be run as a UN-authorized military intervention to bring the world under a world government framework. And since no other nations could rival the U.S. position, almost all nations would go along with the agenda of the U.S. for expanding the power and influence of the United Nations. And a one-world government gets a little closer. It just needs the right crisis at the right time. The Bosnia War would result in the deaths of around 100,000 people. Babylon the Great Harlot, the Big Business Cabal. With the war industry leveraging massive influence on the government through the military-industrial complex, another industrial complex emerges, seeking to influence the governments for its own bottom-line profits. The energy-industrial complex, led by big oil companies, would begin to target the oil fields of Iraq and Syria. But how can they get to them without a war and more bloodshed? What would come next will show without a doubt that Babylon the Great is riding the beast governments into countless wars, and she is drunk with blood. Like a locust plague, Islamic terrorism, from the Fire and Smoke, 2001. When the American and British governments would begin their military intervention into the Middle East with Operation Desert Storm in 1991, they would trigger a plague of warriors whose methods of attack are not designed to overthrow or destroy their governments, but only to torment and terrorize them. And from the fire and the smoke of the Persian Gulf War would come a new kind of war and a new type of enemy. On September the 11th, 2001, they would give their official announcement to the world against the dominant beast government on Earth. And ironically, it is the U.S. government who trained, funded, and armed this plague of terrorists. The Red Warhorse rides into the War on Terror, 2001. Officially called the Global War on Terror, it is a global counterterrorism military campaign initiated by the U.S. in response to the attacks of September the 11th, with many calling it a pretext to reduce civil liberties, infringe on human rights with actions like surveillance, torture, extraordinary rendition, drone strikes, and the use of black sites, which will allow the beast to kill with no open legal process. Its war would displace more than 38 million people total from Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Philippines, and Pakistan, the largest number displaced since World War II, and would lead to the deaths of 4.5 million people, and cost the U.S. $8 trillion, and for what? The Red Warhorse rides into the Iraq War, 2003. And again, another illegal invasion by the United States, this time of the country of Iraq in 2003, a country that had nothing to do with the 9/11 attacks, but had rich oil fields that was targeted by Big Oil. And now that they had influence with the corrupt Bush administration, the push to seize Iraqi oil would begin. The American and British forces would start by seizing all of the oil fields of Iraq, then systematically destroying the Iraqi government. This invasion, based on complete lies by the beast, was condemned by the head of the United Nations as an illegal invasion under international law and a violation of the UN Charter. But the lying, deceptive beast government does not care. It was able to cause the deaths of between 150,000 to 1 million people due to its illegal invasion and occupation of Iraq. The Technological Singularity, The Rise of the Machines, 2005. The technological singularity is a hypothetical future point in time when technological growth becomes uncontrollable and irreversible, resulting in unforeseeable changes to human civilization. One model looks at it as an artificial intelligence explosion, in which self-improvement, knowledge, and capabilities of the intelligence becomes an ever-increasing chain reaction, faster and faster, until an explosion of intelligence results into a powerful superintelligence that far surpasses all human intelligence. In the human versus machine chess matches, the year 2005 would be the last time the human has beaten the machine in a balanced and meaningful match. So in some way, the singularity has already occurred. Machines now easily and effortlessly destroy all human chess players, to the point where they only play machines against other machines to give rise to a dominant beast AI, a king of the artificial intelligence jungle. But the question is, will it be a checkmate against humanity? The star Wormwood, the fall of mainstream news media. The symbol of the falling star, meaning falling messenger, and wormwood, meaning bitter or poisonous, that pollutes the streams of fresh water and rivers, perfectly symbolizes the waters of truth being turned to the lies of propaganda by the beast government, with plans by the government like Project Mockingbird to first spy on journalists and then eventually subvert and manipulate the entire mainstream news industry to control the public's perception of events to the advantage of the intelligence community and then the military-industrial complex. This became clear to everyone with the lies about the Vietnam War, the Panama Invasion, the Persian Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan, and for all to see about the Iraq War and the so-called weapons of mass destruction lies. Two witnesses to the lies and deceit of the beast. With the lies from the governments and the propaganda being poured out from the mainstream news media about the war on terror, the illegal invasion of Iraq, the lies about weapons of mass destruction, the torture of innocent people from all parts of the Middle East, the use of black sites, and the many war crimes being committed, not to mention the illegal surveillance by the beast government of everyone on earth in all nations, friendly or not. It is at this time period that two witnesses to these crimes by the beast would come to the world scene, at the cost of their own lives. Even to this time now, Julian Assange and Edward Snowden serve as a symbol to the world, like two lampstands, exposing the lies and darkness of this beast. A financial earthquake of fraud and economic darkness, 2008. The corrupt and greedy banking system of the U.S. would create an earthquake of fraud on the whole world in 2008, triggering the Great Recession, with mortgage-backed securities tied to American real estate and the risky derivatives market, along with the corrupt U.S. Congress repealing the Glass-Steagall legislation, which had been in place since 1933, that stopped financial institutions from gambling their commercial depositors' savings, retirement, and pension plans. Their subprime mortgage lending scheme would package low-grade loans with high-grade loans and sell them around the world as high-grade loans, complete fraud. Eventually, the credit markets would freeze up because all the banks knew that all the other banks were as corrupt and contaminated with bogus loans as they were, and so they stopped lending money to each other. Then enters the corrupt Federal Reserve and the U.S. government to take the people's money and bail out the corrupt banks and insurance companies. The Coming World Health Dictatorship, H1N1 Pandemic, 2009. The H1N1 pandemic, also known as the swine flu pandemic of 2009, would be the first ever pandemic declared by the scientific arm of the United Nations called the World Health Organization. This event would be a test run of how the World Health Organization would be the coordinator of the public health response for all nations on earth by using the crisis of fear and the declaration of emergency to begin to guide the nations to accept the letting go of their individual sovereignty to the world governmental body for the safety of all nations. This plan would take on a whole new meaning in the year 2020 for all the world to see. The Red Warhorse rides into the Arab Spring 2010. A series of anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions that spread across much of the Arab world beginning in 2010. It began in Tunisia in response to corruption and economic stagnation, partially due to the Great Recession of 2008. It would then spread to Libya, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and Bahrain. It would lead to major uprisings, social violence, riots, civil wars, and insurgencies across the whole of the Middle East. But this Arab Spring showcased new tools by the beast, like social media, added to the same tactics the American beast government used to overthrow the democratically elected governments in Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, as well as Liberia, Vietnam, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, and throughout all of Latin and South America. This beast has wreaked havoc all over the world. A political earthquake, 2016. In 2016, in the United States, a political shift and a great political earthquake would occur. For the first time ever in U.S. presidential politics, a candidate with no military service, no government service at any level, and no political experience would upset the long-time establishment candidate with decades of experience. Donald Trump's victory over Hillary Clinton in 2016 would send a shockwave across the country and around the world. Even today, in 2023, we still feel the aftershocks of this symbolic political earthquake. The opioid epidemic and the rise of Big Pharma, 1990 to present. Beginning in the 1990s, with the push toward using opioid medications for chronic pain management and the increased promotion by pharmaceutical companies for medical professionals to prescribe their opioid medications, along with the lies that they insisted patients could not become addicted. From the 1990s onward, Big Pharma profits would surge, along with the influence they now begin to wield over the lawmakers in Congress. They would become the second most powerful lobby, only behind the war industry. And over 1 million Americans have died from overdoses since the first wave of the epidemic triggered by Big Pharma's push to widely use opioids in the 1990s. A flood from the mouth of the dragon, the C-19 pandemic, 2020. Starting in 2020 and sweeping over the whole world in one wave after the next for exactly 42 months, the C-19 outbreak would flood the whole world with fear and panic, causing the shutdown or disruption of every sector of this world, as if the countries were being invaded by enemies from outside of this world. The governments would view this as a war against the virus, by shutting borders and taking their nations into a siege defense to try and wait out the invading virus. But all of their efforts would fail, and the level of fear on earth would grow to an unbelievable point, of which people would fear to leave their homes at all. The waters turned to blood, the mainstream news media. With the so-called threat from C-19 paralyzing the world, the governments would use their authority and corporate influence on the entire mainstream news apparatus around the world to give not the waters of true and accurate information, but the bitter, bloody poison of propaganda and lies right from the very beginning of this crisis. The people would be traumatized by the lying narratives being pushed by mainstream news media that would begin to prepare people's minds for what would come next from the beast. The Ritual of Mind Control, 2020. What unfolded in 2020 was the operation of a massive ritual of mind control against the population of the whole world. Just as the study of how people are brainwashed into a cult, which was studied extensively by the U.S. government under their MK Ultra programs. It outlines 6 steps. 1. It begins with absolute authoritarianism without accountability, being the declaration of emergency and emergency powers. 2. Zero tolerance for criticism or questions, the censorship and propaganda about the origin of the virus. 3. Isolation, by means of lockdowns to increase the fear response. 4. A belief the leader is right at all times. Trust the government, they said in this crisis. 5. A belief the leader is the exclusive means of knowing truth. Trust the science, they said. 6. Unreasonable fears about the outside world. The lie that this virus is an extreme threat to everyone. What is ironic is that this virus likely came from the government and science in the first place. The man of sin, man of lawlessness, science. Many believe this to be a man, an actual person, that will come at some point in the future with great signs, wonders, and power. But science as a whole has come and has given the world great signs, miraculous wonders, and has shown great power as an institution of man's accumulated and increasing knowledge, which it believes has surpassed any belief in a so-called God or religions of the past. It is why during the virus crisis that all religions had to be shut down so it could reveal itself as mankind's savior. The Antichrist, science. Modern science was raised up in the time period of the brutality of the Roman Catholic Church and the brutality of the rise of Islam, a time in which you convert to the church, die, or be isolated from society. The same with Islam, convert, die, or be isolated. But now that science operates within the governments, it would begin to use the virus crisis to shut down all the religions, and use the authority of the government to force all to accept its solution or be isolated from society. Its solution would become the mark of your allegiance to the advancement of science over the superstition of religions. The January 6th event, a sign of the end, 2021. It is said that history is written by the victors, and so the culmination of the political earthquake of 2016 that would catapult Donald Trump to become president would now open a bottomless pit up in the heart of the country, with the divisions between those who side with Trump and those who are against Trump becoming a permanent divide. The events of January 6, 2021 would only serve to deepen that divide, with many questions and theories of what really took place on that fateful day continuing to circulate. But as the country watched, many would have the feeling that this could be a sign of the end of this nation, like a mortal head wound that festers until death occurs. Babylon the Great Harlot, the Big Business Cabal. The second part of Mystery Babylon, this time represented by the big business of pharmaceutical industry. With the virus crisis crippling the world, the governments would make deals with the greedy pharmaceutical giants to deliver the solution that science has cooked up so that the world could be saved from the virus. The result is a pharmakeia from corrupt companies to corrupt government by corrupt science to ignorant and deceived populations. Waiting for a cure. Trust the science. 2021. So the beast governments would lock down the people for months until a cure could be developed that is safe and effective against the virus. But I ask you, what would you expect to come from lying governments, corrupt corporations, and deceptive science? It's like sheep being led to a slaughter. The salvation from the beast, the man of sin, and Babylon the Great. So in December 2020, the three symbols of the beast, the man of sin, and Babylon the Great, being government, science, and big business, would roll out to a world huddled in fear, propaganda, deception, and lies from the mainstream news media. A false salvation that sadly many would receive with open arms. But the beast, the man of sin, and Babylon the Great demands that all receive the mark of their allegiance or be isolated from society. And so the attacks against anyone who would not accept their cure be punished with restrictions, furloughs, suspensions, and terminations. The pharmakeia, mark of the beast, an abomination that causes desolation. We now see how the symbol of Babylon the Great, big business, and the beast government, along with the man of sin, science, operated as one to force the pharmakeia mark on as many people as they could deceive, intimidate, threaten, and bribe to take the mark. But right from the start, the pharmakeia was all a lie, meaning it is a direct deceit against all of mankind, an abomination indeed. But the coming desolation from this lie will begin to purge this world, as we will see with the unfolding of the next part of this prophecy. Babylon the Great Harlot, the Big Business Cabal. With the lies about the virus crisis beginning to be challenged, the beast government would use another part of Babylon the Great to crush anyone who would dare to question the government, science, or corrupt pharmaceutical corporations. And they would use the industry of big tech to do it, to target anyone on any of the big social media platforms, so they can continue to push their lies and keep the people in darkness. The Red Warhorse leaves Afghanistan, 2021. After 20 years of death and destruction, waste of life, and waste of trillions of dollars, the two-horned beast government would leave another country shattered and impoverished, and for what? To the benefit of the military-industrial complex, a never-ending war machine beast, feeding on the blood, fear, despair, and misery of those conquered, for their profit and in the name of their people, many of whom don't want these wars at all. The Red Warhorse rides into the Ukraine War, 2022. The U.S. and British government could not even wait 1 year after their disgraceful exit from the Afghanistan war before instigating another proxy war against an old enemy, the Russian Federation, to fight Russia through the most corrupt government on earth, the Ukraine government, so the military-industrial complex can sell and test weapons and technologies against the Russians with the blood of the Ukrainians, and possibly trigger a nuclear exchange or an event that could destabilize the entire European continent. The Nephilim, giant corporations devouring and destroying everything in the name of profit. A clue to the symbolic understanding of Babylon the Great Harlot is in the description that she is a habitation of demons. It is said that demons are the evil spirits of the Nephilim, the giant offspring of the fallen angels, who no longer have physical bodies, but exist now as evil spirits, seeking to possess, consume, and destroy in a circular pattern. This spirit of the Nephilim is at work in the pattern of the giant corporations of this world, to possess more and more, devour, and consume all resources to no end, and destroying anything or anyone that attempts to stop it or contain it from ruthlessly pursuing its profits, regardless of the untold pain, suffering, misery, and damage to human life, wildlife, or the environment. The climate change crisis, another deception. A deception to do what? To transfer power, control, and wealth to a corrupt world government, and corrupt world organizations, and corrupt corporations, at the expense, the suffering, and misery of the peoples around the world. For all of the so-called causes of climate change are due to the greed of corporations and their quest for profits, the environment be damned, and corrupt government officials paid off by the corporations to allow their damage to the environment to continue, not to mention the activities of the governments and their militaries in destroying and contaminating this earth. Babylon the Great Harlot, the Religious Cabal. The climate change crisis presents an opportunity for the third part of Babylon the Great to potentially control and steer the beast governments once again. This is the cabal of religion, seeking to unite all faiths and religions to gain the full influence over the governments once again. But it is this part of Babylon the Great that the beast governments will turn to destroy first. Why? It is because within the beast governments is science, the foundation of this modern world, and it hates all the religions as an enemy of its past, and it will not allow religion to seize the coming one world government. The lockdowns against the religions was only the beginning of what is to come. The Black Horse, famine and food shortage after war. The Black Horse, the symbol of the effect after all of the many bloody wars of mankind's history, past and present. It is the symbol of famine and food shortage from the violence of war that has killed over an estimated 120 million people since the beginning of the 20th century up to this point in time. The Pale Horse, Death from War and its Aftermath. The pale horse, the very symbol of death itself, related to war and the pestilence and disease that follows the beast government's thirst for bloodshed and war, at the expense of the innocents, of all of the little ones, the elderly, and the females, usually left to suffer the effects of the government's demonic quest for the violent impulse, for the spilling of blood and warfare.